I'm here with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, the Eric Gleacher Professor of Finance at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He's the author of the recent Financial Times, Goldman Sachs award-winning book, Fault Lines, which was the 2010 Business Book of the Year. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you talk about fault lines, an interesting geological metaphor, and you cite in the book many things, but you really come down to three major fault lines.
Right. Well, I mean, the three I look at, one, the tendency for the U.S. to overspend, both in a secular fashion as well as in a cyclical fashion. What do I mean by that? One, I think that in the United States there's been growing inequality. Why? A lot of it is that technology has moved ahead, needs people with better skills. Similarly, we have trade, which is putting pressure on people to have higher skills in the United States, which is more of a knowledge economy, and lower skilled jobs are migrating elsewhere. Well, in this kind of environment, the United States is not producing enough skilled people, not enough educated people, partly because the quality of schooling in the United States is not that good. So you've got supply not keeping pace while demand for the skilled is increasing. The net effect is growing inequality. People look around, they see others who've gone through college, getting much higher salaries, doing much better. They feel something's wrong. They want something to be done about it, go to their politicians. What do their politicians do? Well, every president since President Nixon has talked about education, but they haven't been able to do very much about it. And so the underlying problem is deep, very difficult to fix. What do you do instead? You expand consumption by pushing credit. So what you see in the United States is income inequality has been going up for the last 25 years, but consumption inequality has not gone up as much. What's made up the difference? Credit. And this is where housing credit is especially an insidious form of credit. If you push it, house prices go up. People can borrow more against their houses. They feel wealthy. They don't feel they're borrowing against their future. And their consumption levels are keeping up. Their lifestyles are keeping up. But they're going more and more into debt. They don't realize it. And this, I think, is part of what happened during the crisis. You had a tremendous explosion in housing credit, especially to low-income households. And some of it was pushed by the government. Some of it, of course, was pushed by the private sector. But what this did was created the underlying conditions for an explosion. So that was fault line, half of the first fault line. The second half, I think, was the tremendous stimulus the government gives through the Fed, through Treasury policies in downturns. And I think this has to do with the second aspect of America, which is problematic, which is the very thin safety net. When you have people who lose their job, they lose, they don't have access to health insurance because insurance is tied to the job. Unemployment benefits run out quickly if you're lucky enough to get it, 6 months in most states. And that's all very well because it gives tremendous incentives to go out and look for a job. If the jobs come back quickly, not a problem. That used to be the pattern in the typical post-war US recession until 1991, when recession started turning and became much longer drawn-out affairs. Jobs came back much more slowly, even though growth came back quickly. We see that happening in this recession because, again, jobs are coming back really slowly, even though the economy is growing. Well, in this kind of environment, again, there's tremendous pressure on the politicians to do something. They put pressure on the Fed. They put pressure on the government to spend. You have enormous stimulus coming, both monetary and fiscal. And that kind of stimulus sometimes takes the economy a little too far. In 2002, 2005, when the Fed stayed on hold, it helped sort of exacerbate the effect of credit into the housing sector by pushing up house prices even more and created that enormous consumption boom where at one point, if you remember, US household savings rates were negative.
Yeah.
Because they were buying houses, seeing the price go up, borrowing against it, and spending it. Well, that's one part, an overspending US. Second part, an underspending rest of the world, who've come to rely on the US to provide that demand. Because after all, creating demand of your own is dangerous. The Latin American countries have realized this again and again. You spend, you tend to overspend. You have credit booms and then busts. The Asian countries realized it. They didn't spend on consumption, they spent on investment. And they overinvested. They had a bust. Right. So emerging markets realized, let's not do that. Let's export to the industrial countries. Let's join Japan and Germany, which have made this into an art. So you've got the rest of the world depending on the US for spending. That's sort of fault line number 2, because they're sending their money to the US also to finance US lifestyles, and that can go on for a while until it stops. And third fault line is, of course, when you've got this money coming in, typically money going across borders, is fragile money, because somebody investing across borders, across a border, doesn't really know that system, has to find some edge which allows them to invest. Typically, when money has gone into emerging markets, the edge has been the government. You lend to the banking.
Government protections, or? Government
protection for that money.
Yeah.
And how do you get that protection? Yeah. You go and you lend to the banks. You know the government can't let the banks go. Right. So implicitly there's a guarantee. And of course the IMF comes in, says, to the government, protect your banks, lends to the government, the banks are protected, and the foreign money gets made whole. So you can allow, the money comes in, fuels booms. They don't care as much what happens, because ultimately they're protected. I think something similar happened in the West this time.
The GSEs.
The foreign money came in, fed the Fannies and the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government guaranteed, no problem, and it created an enormous explosion in credit, which eventually turned from boom to bust.
And when the housing downturn came, there were many Chinese officials in Washington saying, make those GSE things full faith and credit.
Absolutely. And what was implicit became explicit. And so, in a sense, the rest of the world did to the US markets, which US finance had done to the rest of the world before, which is lend in such a way that you're guaranteed. You come out whole.